In the mountains of North Carolina, there sits an abandoned guest book with pages yellowed by time. The last entry bears only an illegible signature, dated October 15th, 1895. What makes this discovery truly chilling is that the woman who found it inherited the inn in 1898, 3 years later, and every single page after that final entry remains completely blank. No guest had signed in for 3 years, yet the inn showed clear signs of recent habitation. But before we dive into Margaret Foxglove's disturbing discovery and what she uncovered about her inheritance, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most mysterious and haunting stories from America's dark past. Tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from. We love connecting with our audience from around the world. Give this video a like if you're ready for a story that will make you question everything you think you know about isolated mountain inns. Now let's return to that autumn day in 1898 when Margaret Foxglove first opened that guest book and began to uncover a truth far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. According to the fragmented records and testimonies that would later emerge, the mystery of Foxglove Inn had been waiting 3 long years for someone to finally piece together its dark secrets. The Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina in 1898 were a place where civilization felt like a distant memory. Small communities dotted the landscape, connected by winding dirt roads that became nearly impassable during winter months. It was in this isolated region, along what locals called the Merchant's Trail, a route used by traveling businessmen moving between Asheville and the smaller trading posts, that Foxglove Inn had served travelers for over 2 decades. Margaret Foxglove, a 34-year-old widow from Charlotte, had never expected to inherit anything from her late husband's estranged uncle, Samuel Foxglove. She had met the man only once, at her wedding 7 years prior, and remembered him as a quiet, intense figure who spoke little and seemed to study every person in the room with calculating eyes. Samuel had operated the inn alone since his wife's death in 1889, and according to the lawyers handling his estate, he had died of consumption in the winter of 1897. The inn itself was a substantial 2-story wooden structure, painted white but now weathered to a dull gray. It sat at a bend in the mountain road, surrounded by thick pine forests that seemed to press in from all sides. The building could accommodate up to 12 guests across 6 rooms, with a large common area downstairs that served as both dining room and gathering place. What struck Margaret immediately upon her arrival was how well maintained everything appeared, despite Samuel's death over a year earlier. The kitchen was stocked with preserved foods, the firewood was neatly stacked, and the guest rooms were clean and ready for occupancy. It was as if someone had been caring for the property, yet when Margaret questioned the neighbors, few as they were in this sparsely populated region, they claimed they hadn't seen anyone at the inn since Samuel's death. Old Mrs. Henderson, who lived nearly 2 miles down the mountain, said she occasionally saw smoke from the chimney during the coldest winter nights, but assumed it was just travelers taking shelter in the abandoned building. Margaret had come to North Carolina with practical intentions. Her husband's death had left her with modest savings, and the lawyers had suggested she could either sell the inn or attempt to operate it herself. The location, they assured her, was prime for catching the steady stream of merchants and businessmen who traveled the mountain routes. What they hadn't mentioned, and what Margaret would soon discover, was that no documented guest had stayed at Foxglove Inn since that mysterious final entry in October of 1895. On her 3rd evening at the inn, while organizing the front desk area, Margaret discovered the leather-bound guest book tucked away in a drawer beneath a stack of old receipts. The book itself was substantial, designed to record years of guests, and she opened it expecting to find a detailed history of the inn's patrons. The early pages told the story she had anticipated. Entries from the 1870s and 1880s showed a steady stream of visitors. Merchants from Knoxville, timber buyers from Virginia, land surveyors working for the railroad companies, and occasionally families making the difficult journey to visit relatives in the mountain communities. Each entry included the guest's name, their city of origin, their business in the area, and the number of nights they planned to stay. Samuel's careful handwriting appeared in the margins of many entries, noting payment received and occasionally adding brief observations about the guests' needs or requests. Margaret found herself smiling at some of the entries: complaints about the mountain cold, praise for Samuel's wife's cooking, notes about business deals completed during their stays. But as she progressed through the book, the entries began to change. Starting around 1892, there were fewer family groups and more single men, almost exclusively businessmen traveling alone. The handwriting became less varied. Where earlier pages showed dozens of different styles of penmanship, the later entries seemed to be written by the same hand, though they bore different signatures. Then came October 15th, 1895, the final entry. The signature was so illegible it might have been deliberate, a harsh scrawl that could have spelled any name. Above it, in what appeared to be Samuel's handwriting, was written, "John Morrison, Charleston, Timber Surveying, 2 nights." But the signature bore no resemblance to the name Morrison, and something about the ink seemed different, darker, as if it had been pressed into the paper with unusual force. Every page after that date was blank, not just empty but pristine, as if they had never been opened. Margaret ran her fingers along the spine of the book and realized that the pages after October 15th, 1895, had never been turned. The binding was stiff, the paper edges still aligned perfectly. For 3 years, no one had signed into Foxglove Inn. That night, Margaret lay awake in Samuel's old room, listening to the October wind howling through the pine trees. She found herself thinking about that final signature, about the 3 years of blank pages, about the mysteriously well-maintained condition of an allegedly abandoned inn. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams of men in dark coats, walking up the mountain road, always approaching the inn but never quite arriving. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Margaret was preparing breakfast when she heard hoofbeats on the road outside. Through the window, she saw a man in his 50s dismounting from a tired-looking horse. He was well-dressed but dusty from travel, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Ma'am," he said when she opened the door, removing his hat respectfully. "Name's Deputy Marshal Thomas Crawford. I was wondering if I might speak with you about this establishment." Margaret invited him in, and over coffee, Crawford explained that he had been investigating a series of disappearances that had occurred in the region between 1892 and 1895. Businessmen, all traveling alone, all last seen on the mountain roads leading to or from Foxglove Inn. None of them had ever reached their intended destinations. "The peculiar thing," Crawford said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "is that we found evidence some of these men had stayed at your inn. Business cards, personal items, even a letter one of them had started writing to his wife, mentioning Samuel Foxglove by name. But when we questioned Mr. Foxglove, he claimed no knowledge of any of these men." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How many men?" she asked. 14 that we could document with certainty. Probably more." Crawford's eyes were serious. "All of them wealthy, all traveling with significant amounts of cash or valuable documents. All of them simply vanished." Crawford explained that the investigation had stalled in 1895. Samuel had been cooperative but maintained his innocence, and without bodies or definitive proof, there was little the authorities could do. The disappearances had stopped abruptly in late 1895, and the case had gradually been forgotten as newer crimes demanded attention. "I heard Samuel had passed," Crawford said. "That's why I wanted to speak with you. Sometimes a property can hold secrets even after its owner dies." After Crawford left, promising to return in a few days with more questions, Margaret found herself examining the inn with new eyes. She walked through each guest room, looking for anything that might have belonged to the missing men. In the room at the end of the hall, she found something that made her blood run cold. Carved into the wooden windowsill, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, were the initials J.M., John Morrison. the name from the final Guestbook entry. But there was something else. As Margaret knelt to examine the carved initials more closely, she noticed dark stains on the floorboards beneath the window. The wood had been scrubbed, but the stains had soaked too deep to remove completely. When she touched them, they felt different from the surrounding wood, rougher, as if the grain had been permanently altered by whatever had been spilled there. That evening, Margaret decided to search Samuel's personal belongings more thoroughly. In his bedroom, behind a loose board in the wall, she discovered a metal box containing documents that would change everything she thought she knew about her inheritance. The box held detailed records, written in Samuel's meticulous handwriting. But these were not the innocent business records she had expected. Instead, she found what appeared to be a ledger of names, dates, and amounts of money. Each entry included a man's name, the date he had arrived at the inn, a detailed description of his belongings and the amount of cash he carried, and finally, a date that was always 1 or 2 days after his arrival. The amounts were staggering. William Thornton of Richmond had carried $3,200 in cash for a land purchase. Marcus Webb from Savannah had been transporting $4,800 in gold certificates. The ledger contained 14 names, and the total value of money and goods listed exceeded $50,000, a fortune that would make a man wealthy for life. But it was the final entry that made Margaret's hands tremble as she read. John Morrison, Charleston, October 15, 1895. Claims to be timber surveyor but asks too many questions about previous guests. Carries badge and official documents. Must be handled carefully. Morrison hadn't been a timber surveyor at all. He had been a detective. Margaret spent the night reading through every document in the box. She found correspondence between Samuel and men whose names she didn't recognize. Arrangements for deliveries to be made to locations throughout the mountains. There were maps marking remote locations, some with notes like deep enough or good drainage. Most disturbing of all was a letter dated November 1895, a month after Morrison's disappearance. Samuel, the heat is too much. We agreed Morrison was the last. No more business until this dies down. Destroy everything and keep quiet. R.B. The letter was signed with initials, but Margaret found a full signature on another document. Robert Blackwood, a name she recognized from local records as a man who had owned a small farm about 5 miles up the mountain road. According to county records, Blackwood had sold his property in early 1896 and left the area. Margaret now understood why the inn had been so well maintained despite Samuel's death. Someone, probably Blackwood or one of his associates, had been keeping it ready, waiting for the investigation to fade completely from memory before resuming their operation. Samuel's death had simply forced a longer pause than originally planned. But what had they done with the bodies of 14 men? And what had made them decide to stop after Morrison's death? Just as you're probably wondering what Margaret discovered next, I want to remind you that stories like this one are rare. Few channels dare to explore the darkest corners of American history. If you're enjoying this investigation into the sinister secrets of Foxglove Inn, hit that like button and share this video with someone who appreciates mysterious true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe. We have many more dark tales from forgotten corners of America. The next morning, Margaret made a decision that would put her in considerable danger. Instead of waiting for Deputy Marshal Crawford to return, she decided to investigate the locations marked on Samuel's maps. Armed with the documents from the hidden box, she set out on foot into the dense forest behind the inn. The first location was only a quarter-mile into the woods, marked on the map with a simple X and the notation WT Deep. Margaret found the spot easily, a natural depression in the forest floor where the undergrowth grew unusually thick and green. When she pushed aside the vegetation with a fallen branch, the earth beneath was soft and dark, and she caught a glimpse of something pale beneath the surface. Margaret didn't dig further. She didn't need to. The rich, dark soil and the unnatural lushness of the plant growth told her everything she needed to know. William Thornton, the man from Richmond who had carried $3,200 in cash, had found his final resting place in this unmarked grave. She visited 3 more locations before her nerve finally failed her. Each site showed the same signs: disturbed earth that had settled over time, vegetation that grew with suspicious vigor, and in one case, fragments of cloth that might once have been part of a businessman's suit. But it was at the 4th location that Margaret made her most chilling discovery. This grave was different from the others, shallower, more hastily dug. As she knelt to examine the site, she noticed something protruding from the earth. It was a piece of metal, tarnished but recognizable, a badge bearing the seal of South Carolina and the words, "Private Detective." John Morrison had been a private detective, just as the final ledger entry had suggested. He had come to Foxglove Inn, not as a guest, but as an investigator. And unlike the businessman who had preceded him, Morrison had been prepared for danger. That was why this grave was different, why it seemed hastily concealed. His death hadn't been planned with the same cold precision as the others. Margaret was so absorbed in her grim discovery that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her until it was too late. A hand fell heavily on her shoulder, and she spun around to find herself face to face with a man she had never seen before. Tall, weathered, with the hard eyes of someone who had lived a violent life. "You shouldn't be here, Ma'am," he said, his voice deceptively gentle. "This is private property." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to speak calmly. "I'm Margaret Foxglove. I own the inn. This is my land." The man's eyes narrowed. "Robert Blackwood," he said. "I think you and I need to have a conversation." Blackwood escorted Margaret back to the inn at gunpoint, his manner polite but unmistakably threatening. Once inside, he made coffee with the casual familiarity of someone who had spent considerable time in the building. "Samuel was getting careless toward the end," Blackwood said, settling into a chair across from Margaret. "Keeping those records was stupid, but then he always was the detail-oriented type." Margaret fought to keep her voice steady. "You killed those men." "We provided a service," Blackwood corrected. "Rich businessmen traveling alone through dangerous mountain country. They were targets for every outlaw and desperado in the region. We simply redirected their wealth to more deserving hands." Blackwood explained the operation with the matter-of-fact tone of a man discussing a legitimate business venture. Samuel would welcome wealthy travelers, assess their financial worth, and then signal Blackwood and his associates. The murders took place in the guest rooms after the victims had retired for the night. Quick, quiet, and efficient. The bodies were disposed of in the forest, and any personal effects that couldn't be easily converted to cash were buried with them. "The beauty of it," Blackwood said, "was the isolation. A man could disappear on these mountain roads for any number of reasons. Bandits, wild animals, accidents, who was to say what really happened? The operation had been extraordinarily profitable. Between 1892 and 1895, they had accumulated enough wealth to buy land, establish legitimate businesses, and live comfortably for the rest of their lives. But John Morrison had changed everything. Morrison wasn't like the others," Blackwood admitted. "He came asking questions about missing persons, showing photographs, taking notes. Samuel panicked and killed him too quickly before we could find out how much he knew or who he had told." After Morrison's death, they had decided to suspend operations indefinitely. Samuel closed the inn to guests, and Blackwood sold his farm and moved to Tennessee, where he used his share of the stolen money to buy a legitimate business. But Samuel's death in 1897 had created a problem: what to do with the inn and its incriminating evidence. "We've been waiting for the right moment to come back and clean things up properly," Blackwood said. "Burn the building, scatter the remains in the forest deeper, make sure nothing could ever connect us to what happened here. Your arrival complicated things." Margaret realized with growing horror that she had walked into a trap. Blackwood hadn't returned to the inn by chance. He had been watching, waiting to see what she would discover. Her inheritance of the property had forced him to act before he was ready. "The problem is," Blackwood continued, "you know too much now. And unlike those businessmen, you're not a stranger passing through. People know you're here. But Margaret had one advantage that Blackwood didn't know about. During her conversation with Deputy Marshal Crawford, she had mentioned her plans to thoroughly explore the property. Crawford had promised to check on her regularly, and he was due to return that very afternoon. As if summoned by her thoughts, the sound of hoofbeats approached the inn. Blackwood cursed and moved to the window, keeping his gun trained on Margaret. "Crawford," he muttered. "This complicates things." What happened next would later be described in court records as one of the most significant criminal cases in North Carolina's mountain region. When Deputy Marshal Crawford arrived at Foxglove Inn that afternoon, he found Margaret and Robert Blackwood in what appeared to be a friendly conversation over coffee. But Margaret's careful positioning at the table, her hand resting near the metal box of documents, immediately alerted the experienced lawman that something was wrong. Crawford's years of investigative work had taught him to read situations quickly. When he noticed the gun partially concealed beneath Blackwood's coat and saw the fear in Margaret's eyes, he was ready to act. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Blackwood, realizing his position was hopeless, attempted to flee but was captured after a short pursuit through the forest. The investigation that followed shocked the entire region. Using Samuel's meticulous records and Blackwood's eventual confession, authorities were able to identify not only the 14 documented victims, but 3 additional men whose disappearances had never been connected to Foxglove Inn. The recovery of personal effects from the forest graves provided closure to families who had spent years wondering about the fate of their loved ones. Blackwood's trial revealed the full scope of the operation. 2 other men had been involved, brothers named Earl and Jimmy Watts, who had fled to California after Morrison's death. They were eventually tracked down and brought back to face justice. All 3 men were convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death, though Blackwood died in prison before his execution could be carried out. The most poignant moment in the trial came when John Morrison's widow testified about her husband's final assignment. Morrison had been hired by the families of 3 missing businessmen to investigate their disappearances. His last letter to his wife, found among Samuel's hidden documents, described his growing suspicions about Foxglove Inn and his plan to gather evidence by posing as a guest. "My darling Sarah," the letter read, "I believe I am close to solving this terrible mystery. The innkeeper watches me too closely, and I fear my questions have aroused suspicion. If something should happen to me, know that the truth lies in this cursed place. Tell the families that their loved ones did not die in vain. Their deaths will ensure justice for all." Margaret faced a difficult decision about the inn's future. The property, tainted by its history, seemed impossible to operate as a guest house. Local sentiment was divided. Some believed the building should be burned down, while others argued it should be preserved as a reminder of the victims. In the end, Margaret donated the land to the county with the stipulation that it be converted into a memorial park for the 17 men who had died there. The memorial, dedicated in 1901, bears a simple inscription: "In memory of 17 souls who sought shelter and found tragedy. May their deaths serve as a reminder that evil can flourish in the most unexpected places, but justice, though delayed, will always prevail." But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire case was revealed during the cleanup of Foxglove Inn. When investigators thoroughly searched the building, they found modifications that showed how carefully planned the murders had been. Guest room doors had been fitted with special locks that could only be opened from the outside. Floorboards in several rooms had been altered to muffle sounds. Most disturbing of all, they discovered a hidden compartment beneath the inn's main staircase where personal effects from the victims had been stored: watches, rings, photographs, and letters that would never reach their intended recipients. The Foxglove Inn case became a cautionary tale throughout the mountain regions of North Carolina and neighboring states. It demonstrated how isolation and trust could be weaponized by those with criminal intent, and how the absence of reliable communication could allow such atrocities to continue for years undetected. Margaret Foxglove returned to Charlotte after the trials concluded, carrying with her the knowledge that her inheritance had come at the cost of 17 innocent lives. She never spoke publicly about her experience, but those close to her said she never fully recovered from the psychological impact of her discoveries. She spent her remaining years supporting charities that aided crime victims' families, as if trying to atone for the connection her family name would forever bear to one of the region's darkest chapters. This case reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most respectable, who offer shelter when we are most vulnerable. The blank pages in that guest book weren't just empty spaces. They were silent witnesses to a truth too terrible for words. What do you think about this dark chapter from America's past? Does it make you reconsider how much we trust strangers, especially in isolated places? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as haunting as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We uncover forgotten mysteries like this one every week. Share this video with someone who loves true crime stories and let us know what other dark tales from American history you'd like us to investigate. Until next time, remember that the past holds secrets that can still chill us to the bone.